The morning sun had barely peeked through the massive windows of Chicago O'Hare International Airport when a young woman rushed through the crowded terminal, her wheeled carry-on clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. Her dark hair was neatly tied back, and she wore a well-pressed navy blue blazer, the uniform of countless business travelers making their way across the country that day. She wasn't running late. Being punctual was deeply ingrained in her nature after years of business travel. As a regional sales director for a tech company, she had mastered the art of efficient travel. Her carry-on contained exactly what she needed: her laptop, a change of clothes, essential toiletries, and the lucky charm her father had given her when she landed her first job: a small jade pendant that had belonged to her grandmother. The boarding process for United Airlines Flight 2317 to Seattle was proceeding smoothly. She smiled warmly at the gate agent while scanning her boarding pass, exchanging a brief "good morning" that felt genuine rather than merely polite. Making her way down the jet bridge, she couldn't shake off a strange feeling. Something felt different about this flight, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. As she reached her window seat in row 23, she went through her usual pre-flight routine. She tucked her carry-on in the overhead bin, keeping only her slim laptop bag containing her essential items. A young mother struggling with a baby stroller caught her attention, and she paused her routine to help, earning a grateful smile and a quiet "thank you." These small moments of human connection made the frequent travel more bearable. Settling into her seat, she pulled out the safety card, studying it despite having flown this route dozens of times before. Her father always insisted on this ritual: better to know and not need, than need and not know, he would say in his characteristically wise way. The thought of him brought a small smile to her face as she remembered their Sunday phone call just 2 days ago. The familiar announcements began overhead as the plane filled with a mix of business travelers in pressed suits and tourists in comfortable clothes. She observed the flight attendants going about their pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency, noting how one of them took extra time to help an elderly passenger store his cane safely. Through the window, she watched the ground crew loading the last of the luggage, their movements coordinated like a well-rehearsed dance. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, and she could see other planes taxiing in the distance, their bodies gleaming in the early light. She pulled out her phone to switch it to airplane mode, pausing briefly to look at the photo of her father that served as her background. A candid shot of him laughing in his garden, surrounded by the roses he tenderly cared for since retiring. The image reminded her to check if he'd sent any messages about his doctor's appointment scheduled for later that week. As the engines hummed to life and the plane began pushing back from the gate, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, following another of her father's travel tips: the best way to start any journey is with a moment of gratitude. Little did she know that this routine flight, one of countless others she'd taken, was about to become the most memorable journey of her life. The plane taxied towards the runway, joining a crew of aircraft waiting for takeoff. She watched the morning light paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, completely unaware that in less than an hour, her world would be turned upside down, and she would find herself at the center of a story that would touch hearts across the nation. The first 30 minutes of the flight passed smoothly as the aircraft cruised at its cruising altitude. Passengers had settled into their usual in-flight routines. Some dozed off, others buried themselves in books or laptops. The gentle hum of the engines provided a soothing backdrop to the quiet cabin atmosphere. But something began to change. The young business professional, who had earlier seemed so composed, started showing signs of restlessness. Her fingers drummed nervously against her armrest, and she kept glancing at her phone, despite knowing it was in airplane mode. A subtle shift in her demeanor caught the attention of the passenger sitting next to her, who noticed how she kept adjusting her seat position and checking her watch every few minutes. The first call button chime didn't draw much attention. It's common enough on flights. A flight attendant responded promptly, finding the usually collected business traveler requesting to check if there was any way to get internet connectivity. The flight attendant explained apologetically that the Wi-Fi system was temporarily down on this aircraft, something that had been announced before takeoff. 10 minutes later, the call button lit up again. This time, the same passenger asked if they might be landing any earlier than scheduled. The flight attendant, maintaining her professional composure, explained that they were actually running exactly on time. Something in the passenger's voice, a slight tremor, an undercurrent of worry, made the flight attendant pause and ask if everything was all right. The passenger merely nodded, though her tightly clasped hands told a different story. Other passengers began to notice the frequency of these interactions. A kind elderly woman across the aisle watched with growing concern as the young professional's anxiety seemed to escalate. She'd seen enough troubled flyers in her years of travel to recognize that this wasn't ordinary flight anxiety. Something else was brewing beneath the surface. The third time the call button chimed, the lead flight attendant decided to handle it personally. She found the passenger visibly distressed, though trying hard to maintain composure. Her questions were becoming more urgent. About emergency landings, about ways to get messages from the ground, about flight durations to different cities. The flight attendant noticed she kept touching a jade pendant around her neck, almost like a worry stone. Fellow passengers were now exchanging glances. A businessman 2 rows back removed his headphones, his movie forgotten as he observed the unfolding situation. A mother traveling with her young daughter quietly explained to the curious child that sometimes grown-ups get worried too, teaching a subtle lesson in empathy rather than judgment. The tension in row 23 continued to build. The passenger's breathing had become more rapid, and despite the cabin's cool temperature, small beads of sweat had formed on her forehead. She kept looking out the window, then back at her phone, as if willing it to show her something, anything. What made this situation particularly puzzling for the crew was how the passenger oscillated between moments of complete composure and visible distress. During the brief periods when flight attendants would check on other passengers, she appeared to be trying to calm herself, taking deep breaths and closing her eyes. But then something would trigger her anxiety again, and the cycle would repeat. The situation reached a turning point when the seat belt sign illuminated due to expected turbulence. As the plane began to encounter slight bumps, the mounting tension in the passenger seemed to reach a breaking point. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the armrests, but it wasn't the turbulence that was bothering her. Something else was causing her evident distress. Unknown to everyone aboard Flight 2317, this growing unease wasn't just another case of a nervous flyer or claustrophobia. Behind the increasingly concerning behavior lay a story that would soon transform everyone's understanding of the situation. A reminder that human drama often runs deeper than its surface appearance. The moment that changed everything happened during a patch of moderate turbulence. The aircraft swayed gently, causing the overhead bins to creak and sending the usual ripple of tension through the cabin. That's when she stood up, not with anger or defiance, but with a kind of desperate determination that caught everyone off guard. The lead flight attendant, a woman with 20 years of experience handling every imaginable situation in the skies, immediately noticed. She had been keeping a watchful eye on row 23, her instincts telling her that something was building. As she made her way down the aisle, carefully maintaining her balance against the plane's movement, she could see tears streaming down the passenger's face. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat," she said gently, her voice carrying both authority and concern. "We're experiencing some turbulence, and it's not safe to be standing." The passenger looked at her with red-rimmed eyes, clutching her jade pendant so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Please," the passenger whispered, her voice breaking. "We need to land. I can't stay in the air any longer." The words came out between shallow breaths, her professional demeanor completely crumbled. Other passengers watched the scene unfold, their earlier annoyance giving way to concern as they witnessed her evident distress. A young doctor seated a few rows ahead stood up, despite the seatbelt sign. "I'm a medical professional," she offered quietly to the flight attendant. "Would you like me to take a look?" The flight attendant nodded gratefully, appreciating the unexpected support. But as the doctor approached, the distressed passenger shook her head. It's not. It's not a medical emergency. At least not mine," she managed to say. Her words puzzled everyone within earshot. The doctor and flight attendant exchanged glances, trying to understand what she meant. The passenger pulled out her phone again, staring at the blank screen as if willing it to come to life. By now, the entire cabin was aware of the situation. A businessman who had been complaining earlier about the frequent call button usage now sat quietly, his face softened with empathy. A teenager who had been filming the scene on her phone slowly lowered it, feeling suddenly ashamed about potentially exploiting someone's genuine distress. The flight attendant tried a different approach. "Can you tell me what's happening? Maybe we can figure this out together." Her voice was soft, meant only for the passenger, though in the hushed cabin, others could hear too. The human connection seemed to reach through the passenger's panic. "My father," she started, her voice trembling. "He lives alone, and I have this feeling. Something's wrong. I know it sounds crazy, but I've never had a feeling this strong before." She clutched the jade pendant again. "He gave me this, you know. It was my grandmother's, and now it feels like it's burning." The turbulence had settled, but the emotional storm in the cabin continued to build. Another flight attendant arrived with a cup of water, offering it with a gentle smile. The passenger took it with shaking hands but didn't drink. Her eyes kept darting between the window and the ceiling, as if searching for a solution somewhere in the airplane's architecture. "I understand you're worried," the lead flight attendant said, maintaining her calm presence. "But I need you to help me understand. What do you need right now?" It was a simple question, but it opened the floodgates. The passenger's composed facade finally shattered completely. "I need to get to Portland," she said, her voice rising with urgency. "My father. He had a doctor's appointment today. He hasn't been well, and now I can't reach him, and something's telling me." She stopped, overwhelmed by emotion. The jade pendant slipped from her fingers, hanging loose around her neck. The revelation sent a ripple of understanding through the nearby passengers. What had seemed like disruptive behavior now took on a new dimension. The elderly woman across the aisle wiped away a tear, reminded of similar worries about her own children. The businessman who had been annoyed earlier now rummaged in his bag, pulling out a packet of tissues and quietly passing them forward. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, causing everyone in the cabin to fall silent. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to a situation on board, we'll be making an unscheduled landing at Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, prepare for landing." The announcement sparked immediate reactions throughout the cabin. Passengers pulled out their phones, checking connection signals and departure boards for alternative flights. A businessman in first class sighed loudly about missing his connecting flight, but a sharp look from the elderly woman nearby silenced his complaints. The lead flight attendant remained beside the distressed passenger, who had finally returned to her seat but sat rigid with tension. "We're about 20 minutes from landing," she explained softly. "Is there someone we can try to contact for you once we're on the ground?" The passenger clutched her jade pendant, tears still flowing silently down her cheeks. Through the windows, passengers could see the plane beginning its descent, the wing flaps adjusting as they cut through clouds. The cabin crew moved efficiently through their emergency landing procedures, their practiced movements somehow both reassuring and concerning to those watching. A young mother across the aisle tried to distract her curious child, who kept asking why the lady was crying. "Sometimes," she whispered to her daughter, "grown-ups cry because their hearts are too full of love and worry for someone." The simple explanation carried through the quiet cabin, causing several passengers to glance down at their own phones, thinking of their loved ones. The flight crew's professionalism shone through as they secured the cabin, managing to treat the situation with urgency while avoiding any sense of panic. They spoke in hushed tones, their expressions calm, but their movements quick and purposeful. The lead flight attendant had already radioed ahead, requesting both medical personnel and police presence. Standard procedure for any situation requiring an emergency landing. As the plane descended, the distressed passenger's breathing became more erratic. The doctor who had offered help earlier passed forward a paper bag without being asked, a small gesture that spoke volumes about the human capacity for understanding and support. Other passengers who had initially filmed the scene on their phones now sat quietly, many saying silent prayers or sending good thoughts. The plane banked left, and the Minneapolis skyline came into view through the windows. A flight attendant knelt beside the passenger, speaking quietly. "The police will meet us at the gate. It's standard procedure. Please don't be alarmed. They're here to help sort everything out." The passenger nodded, her hands shaking as she tried to gather her belongings. The landing gear descended with a loud thunk that echoed through the cabin. Out the windows, passengers could see emergency vehicles positioned along the runway, their lights flashing despite the clear day. Standard protocol for an emergency landing. The sight caused a ripple of whispers through the cabin, but the atmosphere remained surprisingly supportive. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, steady and reassuring. "Flight attendants, prepare for landing." The plane descended smoothly, testament to the pilot's skill and experience. As they touched down, several passengers released audible sighs of relief, not from fear of the landing itself, but from the shared tension of the situation. They taxied quickly to a gate, faster than normal landings. Through the windows, passengers could see the flashing lights of police vehicles and airport security. The young business professional sat quietly now, exhausted from the emotional storm, but still clearly distressed. Her fellow passengers, who just hours ago had been strangers united only by their destination, now watched with concern and sympathy as they waited for the next chapter of this unexpected drama to unfold. The aircraft door opened with a familiar hiss, but the scene that followed was anything but routine. 3 police officers boarded the plane, their uniforms crisp and their movements measured. The lead officer, a woman with gentle eyes and graying hair at her temples, took in the situation with experienced calm. Behind her, 2 younger officers positioned themselves carefully in the narrow aisle. The cabin remained unusually quiet. Phones appeared in passengers' hands, their cameras ready to capture what many assumed would be another viral video of an unruly passenger being removed. The businessman who had earlier passed tissues now spoke up, surprising everyone. "Maybe we could all put our phones down for this one." His quiet suggestion rippled through the cabin, and one by one, phones lowered. The lead officer approached row 23, where the distressed passenger sat clutching her carry-on bag and jade pendant. Unlike the tense confrontations people had come to expect from such situations, this encounter started with a simple, quiet question. "Would you mind telling me what's troubling you today?" Something in the officer's tone, maternal, understanding, yet professional, seemed to reach through the passenger's distress. "I need to get to Portland," she explained, her voice hoarse from crying. "My father. I know something's wrong. I've never felt like this before." The younger officers exchanged glances, clearly expecting a different kind of situation. One of them, noticing the passenger's business attire and the way she professionally packed her belongings despite her distress, stepped forward. "Ma'am, have you tried calling any hospitals in Portland?" The question was practical, but delivered with genuine concern. The passenger nodded, wiping her eyes with the borrowed tissues. "I can't get through to anyone. The one time I had signal during takeoff, I got a strange text from his neighbor, but the connection cut out before I could read it all." Her hands trembled as she showed them her phone, the message fragment visible on the screen. Meanwhile, other passengers had begun sharing their own stories in hushed voices. An elderly man mentioned his wife's recent health scare, while a college student whispered about rushing home when her mom had fallen ill. The cabin had transformed from a space of judgment to one of shared human experience. The lead officer made a decision that showed why experience matters in law enforcement. Instead of immediately escorting the passenger off, she sat in the empty seat next to her. "Let's figure this out together," she said, pulling out her own phone. "I have a direct line to Portland PD. We can request a welfare check on your father right now." This practical solution seemed to calm the passenger more than any previous attempts at comfort. The other passengers watched as the officer made the call. Her calm professionalism, a stark contrast to what many had expected from a police intervention on an airplane. The flight attendants, still maintaining their professional composure, began helping other passengers arrange for connecting flights, turning a potential scene of conflict into one of community support. The young mother who had earlier explained things to her daughter now offered her own phone charger, seeing the passenger's device was nearly dead. As the lead officer spoke with Portland authorities, the passenger's story began to make more sense. The fragments of text message, her father's recent health issues, the missed doctor's appointment. Pieces of a puzzle that painted a picture of a daughter's intuition rather than a disruptive passenger's defiance. The younger officers maintained their position in the aisle, but their stance had softened. One of them quietly helped an elderly passenger retrieve their luggage while waiting, a small gesture that didn't go unnoticed by those watching. This wasn't going to be the kind of police intervention video that goes viral for all the wrong reasons. In the bustling terminal of Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, the truth finally emerged in full. The lead officer sat with the passenger at a quiet gate, away from curious onlookers. As they waited for news from Portland, the passenger pulled out her phone and finally managed to load the complete text message that had started everything. The message was from her father's next-door neighbor, an elderly woman who had been keeping an eye on him. "Your father collapsed in the garden. Called ambulance. Street Vincent's Hospital. Come quick." The timestamp showed it had arrived during those brief moments after takeoff, when phones sometimes briefly connect to ground networks. The passenger's voice shook as she explained her father's recent history. "He's been having dizzy spells for weeks," she said, twisting the jade pendant between her fingers. The doctor's appointment today was supposed to be for tests. He kept saying it was nothing, just normal aging, but something felt wrong. The younger officer, who had been coordinating with Portland authorities, approached with news. Her father had indeed suffered a stroke while tending to his beloved rose garden. The neighbor had found him quickly, thanks to their daily routine of morning waves through the kitchen window. When he hadn't appeared with his usual cup of coffee, she'd known something was wrong. Other passengers from the flight had gathered nearby, their own travels temporarily forgotten. The businessman who had been so understanding offered his airline miles to help with a new flight to Portland. The young mother who had explained things to her child approached with a coffee she'd bought from a nearby shop. The lead officer, still sitting with the passenger, shared a story of her own. 23 years ago," she said softly, "I ignored a gut feeling about my own mother. Ever since then, I've learned to trust when people say they just know something's wrong with family. That kind of knowing goes deeper than logic." Airport staff, having heard the situation, were already working on arrangements. An airline representative approached with a boarding pass for the next direct flight to Portland, leaving in just over an hour. "We've upgraded you to first class," she said warmly, "and we've called ahead to have a car service ready when you land in Portland." The passenger's hands steadied for the first time since the ordeal began. "He's alive," she whispered, relief washing over her face. "The doctors say they caught it early enough. If the neighbor hadn't—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Everyone understood the weight of timing in such situations. Some passengers from the original flight had missed their connections waiting to hear the outcome, but none seemed to mind. The elderly woman who had watched everything unfold on the plane smiled through tears, remembering similar moments from her own life. "Family is worth every missed connection," she said, patting the passenger's hand. The young doctor who had offered help on the plane had stayed as well. She took a moment to explain what the passenger could expect at the hospital, offering professional insight with personal warmth. The first 24 hours are crucial, she explained, but early intervention makes a huge difference. Your instincts may have played a bigger role than you know. As the truth of the situation spread through the terminal, it touched something universal in everyone who heard it. The story of a daughter's intuition, a neighbor's attention, and a community of strangers coming together transformed what could have been a scene of conflict into something entirely different. The story could have ended there, but social media had other plans. A video of the police escort had already started circulating online, showing only the moment the officers boarded the plane. Comments began flooding in, quick to judge without knowing the full story. That's when something remarkable happened. The lead officer, with the passenger's permission, decided to share the real story on the police department's social media page. Her post began simply, "Today, we responded to what was reported as an unruly passenger situation. What we found instead was a reminder of why we must look deeper than our first assumptions." The post quickly gained traction, spreading across various platforms. The young mother from the flight shared her own perspective. "I watched my daughter learn an important lesson today, that sometimes what looks like disruption is actually love in its most desperate form." Her comment resonated with thousands. Meanwhile, in Portland, the passenger finally reached her father's hospital room. The doctors confirmed what her instincts had told her: timing had been crucial. The early intervention, made possible by the neighbor's quick action and her own insisted emergency landing, had significantly improved his chances of recovery. Back in Minneapolis, the story continued to unfold. The airline, initially prepared to ban the passenger for disruptive behavior, instead used the incident to review their protocols for passengers receiving emergency notifications during flights. They began developing new guidelines for handling similar situations, acknowledging that in an interconnected world, such scenarios were becoming more common. The businessman who had offered his airline miles wrote a LinkedIn post about the experience. "In business, we often talk about data-driven decisions. Today, I witnessed the power of human intuition and compassion driving decisions. It changed how I'll approach both business and life." 3 weeks later, the passenger's father was making remarkable progress in his recovery. The hospital's physical therapy team was amazed by his determination, though they noted he talked more about his daughter's actions than his own recovery. His rose garden, tended by the watchful neighbor during his absence, waited for his return. The story sparked discussions across the country about intuition, family bonds, and the quick judgments we make in the age of viral videos. Mental health professionals weighed in, explaining how deep familial connections can sometimes create almost supernatural seeming awareness of loved ones in distress. The elderly neighbor who had first noticed something wrong received hundreds of letters from people sharing similar stories of community watchfulness. She began a neighborhood program encouraging daily check-ins among neighbors, especially those living alone. The idea spread to other communities, proving that one moment of attentiveness could inspire lasting change. The airline industry took notice too. Several major carriers began reviewing their emergency communication policies, recognizing that in an age where bad news can arrive at 30,000 feet, they needed better ways to help passengers handle personal crises mid-flight. The police department received messages from law enforcement agencies nationwide, praising their compassionate approach. The lead officer's handling of the situation became a teaching example in training sessions about the importance of assessing situations with empathy before action. One quiet morning, about a month after the incident, the passenger sat with her father in his garden. The roses were blooming again, and he was strong enough to sit outside for short periods. As she helped him prune a particularly stubborn branch, he touched the jade pendant she still wore. "You know," he said softly, "your grandmother always said this jade had special powers. I never believed it until now." The story continues to be shared, not for its drama or conflict, but for its reminder of what matters most. In an era where viral videos often show the worst of human behavior, this one showed something different. The power of intuition, the importance of looking beyond surface appearances, and how a moment of crisis can bring out the best in strangers.